All right. Thank you so much for everyone for joining this X Space. My name is Kudakwashe Manjonjo. I'm from PowerShift Africa. I am the Just Transitions Advisor there. And thanks so much to coming to this X Space where we'll be discussing what is the Africa Green Mineral Strategy that has been recently launched earlier in the year by the African Union. Just a brief background, I think, just to at least set this conversation that we're going to have. The African Union, with a number of its partners, such as the AFDB, as well as other entities from the African Union, over the last 2 years have been set up the strategy around the green minerals that are endowed on the continent in Africa. This strategy is not the first of its kind in terms of the mineral space. However, it's very specific to the critical energy transition minerals that we're hearing a lot more about, such as chromium, lithium, platinum group of metals, cobalt, copper, etc. What is interesting about the Africa Green Mineral Strategy is that it is entering a global landscape of policy around strategies, and it is not the only one. For example, we're quite well known of the Belt and Road Initiative in China, the Green New Deal in USA, as well as a lot of a plethora, if anything, of policies from the European Union. So this green mineral strategy really comes at a good time, I'd like to believe, for the African states to really understand their role within the space. And thankfully enough, you have the fortune of not having to listen to me for the next hour to speak about this, because we've been able to get people who are a lot better and have got more knowledge and understanding of this conversation. And in today's conversation, I am joined by Adrian Joseph, who is part of the South African Institute of International Affairs. I also have Alaka Lungonzo, who's part of Global Witness. Also, my sister Judy Hoffmeyer, who's the Green Transition Minerals Fellow at Africa Policy Research Institute, as well as Farai Shonam Tondoro, my big brother from the Africa Institute of Environmental Law. So this is a great setup, and I think they're really going to provide us some key understandings. So how we're going to have the session today and this conversation, I'm going to ask one or two questions to each of the panelists, and I'm hoping they can limit their interventions for each question to about 2 or 3 minutes, because the intensity and the desire of this conversation is to ensure that we get some conversations around this for people and speakers who will be keen to understand a lot more about this. We're trying to position this as a tool that is going to be used for people to understand what the strategy is all about, and hopefully we can constantly reach out, especially within the civil society space and government space, to really express the strategy. Because at the end of the day, as most of us are on this call, being African, it's up to us to really own these strategies and to see where they're working, where they're not working, and take it from there. So without further much ado, I think I'll then ask Adrian Joseph from SIA to come on board. And I think my question to you, I think, Adrian, is to give us a deeper base understanding of what the Africa Green Mineral Strategy is. What are the key highlights, in your opinion, of the strategy?
Thank you so much, Kuda. Thank you to PowerShift Africa, as well as Global Witness, for hosting this X Space, and to all the listeners. What I'd say about the African Green Mineral Strategy, I think for me there are a couple of things that stand out. I think the first thing to note is, what's in a name. It is the African Green Mineral Strategy rather than the African Critical Mineral Strategy. And while at times it may seem that, whether we use critical or green or transition or energy minerals, these semantics they're not just semantics, they're sort of underlying and at times divergent understandings about why these minerals are critical and who are they critical for. So I think the sort of high level point that I'd make is to say it is the African Green Mineral Strategy, and that is because the African Union was quite intent on emphasizing the fact that these minerals are key for Africa's green energy transition, and as well as for its structural transformation. And I think this is a sort of distinct understanding from the sort of prevailing terminology around critical minerals, which is primarily a Western one, which emphasizes things like security of supply and supply chain diversification. So that's the first thing I'd say, that it's the African Green Mineral Strategy rather than the Critical Mineral Strategy. The second thing I'd say is that the African Green Mineral Strategy, as you mentioned, is not the first sort of continental framework of its kind, but I think it's important to stress that the Green Mineral Strategy is not something separate from the African mining vision, but is an updated framework that is accounting for the fact that these critical minerals have now become an issue of geopolitical importance, given the fact that when the African mining vision was drawn up in 2009, that predates the issue of critical minerals. So this African green mineral strategy is not a substitute for the African mining vision. It's a complementary framework that recognizes the new geopolitical events around these minerals. And then finally, what I'd also say is that the African Green Mineral Strategy is a continental framework. Now, that seems like a self-evident thing to say, but it is important to note that, to my knowledge, the only sort of other major actors who have sort of regional or block strategies on critical minerals is the European Union. And I think when discussing the African Green Mineral Strategy, we should always bear in mind that it is a continental strategy, and that sort of increases its potential in certain ways, but it also brings about certain obstacles to its implementation in relation to like strategies at the national level or strategies at the regional level. So I think I'll just park my comments there for now. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Adrian. I think that's very informative. And what I really caught on from what you were stating there is that the language is very important, that the African Union decided not to call it critical, rather call it green. And I think it's important from that point of view, from my own readings and understanding, the criticality of this has led to a very global north focus in terms of understanding what minerals are, where it seems of more of a supply chain issue rather than the value chain issue. And I think that's what the African Green Mineral Strategy is trying to show. I think it's important to have a narrative fight really from the African state and African communities when it comes to this. Words are important, language is important, and hopefully that increases our ownership and understanding of that. So thank you for that, Adrian. I'd like to then move on to Alaka Lugonzo from Global Witness. She's an excellent expert in natural resource governance, and she's been very involved over the last decade or so within the minerals governance space, not only from the renewable energy side of things, but also from the oil and gas. And because of that, she has quite a lot of experience within civil society. And I think, Alaka, for me, my question to you is, there's always been, at least in decades past, a harping on that a lot of African policies do not engage with civil society, or they do not find room or space for civil society to engage with them, not only from a critique point of view, but from an implementation point of view. So my question to you, Alaka, is what are the potential pathways, I think, for civil society to play towards the implementation of the strategy?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Kuda, and thank you for allowing us to collaborate on this space. As Kuda said, I've been engaging a lot with the natural resource, more from an extractive angle, but more from a governance and advocacy point of view. So I'll just pick up from where Adrian left off, and he mentioned a few things around what are the tenets of the African Green Mineral Strategy. It's a continental initiative which was aimed at leveraging, African vast mineral resources, what they are calling "quote unquote" green minerals. And it's important that he also mentioned that the naming and the wording of the criticality or the, if they are strategic or if they are green. I think that is very important because that also goes towards their value on the continent. I think it's important for us to look at our minerals on the continent as them being used for industrialization or for energy security or for inclusive growth. And I think if you look through the African Green Mineral Strategy, you see it's anchored against, like 4 pillars, whereby there's advancing mineral development, where you're looking at it, how the green mineral strategy can enhance governance. And I know Adrian has mentioned about the African mining vision, and I think this is sort of like an uplift of how countries can be able to leverage the green mineral strategy in terms of creating sort of national or country mining visions towards leveraging on their minerals. It's also anchored on enabling investments and infrastructure, just creating an enabling environment whereby we can leverage on our minerals for investments or the growth of our infrastructure. We know how far as a continent we can be able to get, and if we can be able to leverage on these minerals for our own advancement and at our own pace, and I think it would be very beneficial. I know there's also conversations around skills and techs, jobs for the future. I think this strategy can also be one of those things or a blueprint that we can actually use to create some of those opportunities. Also around value chains, there's issues around value addition, industrialization, manufacturing. And I know we've seen very many countries who have recently banned, the export of raw materials. So I think it's a good initiative or a continental initiative to look to that. So to your question, what is the role of civil society? I think right now, civil society in Africa needs to come together to advocate, to educate and influence, and also create enabling environments whereby we can collaborate to aid the implementation of the green mineral strategy. Look, I know we have very many other strategies outside there. Countries are yet to even domesticate the African mining vision, but we are tasked to move, quickly and fast because other regions of the world have already created their strategies around our minerals on the continent. Yet on the continent, we do not have an opportunity to have a say on what we want to do with our minerals. Do we want to use them for industrialization? Do we want to use them to develop our own local value chains? Do you want them to use them for our own jobs? So I think our role as civil society is to come through and to figure out what we need to do in that area. Number one, I think the first thing is we need to figure out is to promote people-centered participation and ownership. I think as civil society that we need to support national legislation. So we need to create an environment whereby governments, civil society, private sector, and industry can come together to put together legislative frameworks in which we can support this green through the tenets of the green mineral strategy. And that's a role of civil society to create, that sort of environment where those conversations are had. I know I've mentioned about country mining visions. I know most countries normally just create mining codes, but they don't realize that the African mining vision or the African green mineral strategy can be a good basis for them to actually create mining codes. They don't have to start from scratch. They can actually use some of those tenets of the African green mineral strategy. I think we also need a civil society to come together and support, policies around manufacturing that could lead to value addition and beneficiation, which could aid to locally sourcing of raw materials, labor, and technology. Because a lot of times you see Africa is the largest continent with the youth that is unemployed. So where are those youth going to get jobs? So I think it's important that we create locally, homegrown solutions around what labor looks like for us, what technological advancement looks like for us, what skills transfer looks like for us from a regional perspective. Why can't Kenya leverage on Uganda in certain skills? Why can't Tanzania leverage on Zambia on certain skills? If a country has the raw materials and another country has the labor, why can't we leverage amongst ourselves? And now this brings in another policy on the African, the Free Trade Continental Agreement that has, taken a bit of a hit in terms of implementation. Another thing is more homegrown, financing solutions and innovations. I think civil society needs to figure out how we can be able to have conversations about access to fair financing mechanisms. A lot of times the grants and the loans that we get from the global north or from the west normally comes with a lot of tags and normally comes with a lot of requirements on the continent for us to be able to access those investments. But if you can be able to figure out homegrown, financing solutions and innovations on the continent, then we can be able to, to leverage this green mineral strategy. Just another thing I think we need to capitalize on is transparency and accountability, but from a continental perspective. There's a lot of conversations about data, geological data. Do we as a continent actually know how much in terms of reserves we do have on the minerals, whether it's our lithium, whether it's our nickel, and we as civil society can actually push our governments to act towards actually giving us the data and the information in terms of geology. Also opening contracting, we also see a lot of times our governments get into contracts with big mining companies, and we do not have access to those contracts, and we do not know what are the sources of revenue and what are the sources of investments that have gone into that. So I think it's important for civil society to hold our governments accountable in terms of the revenue that they're also generating. Are these revenues actually going to be used for advancing our developments, or they're actually going into paying the large, the debts that we've incurred, also to prevent illicit financial flows and the export of raw materials. Finally, last but not least, we need to educate our local communities. I think we've reached a point whereby we need to prioritize our community in terms of community-centered initiatives. Our communities need to be brought on the table when we're fostering some of these conversations around what sort of initiatives that are needed in certain communities. I know there are very many communities that don't participate in public participation, not because they don't want, but because they're not put front and center. And then when these projects are brought onto the ground, they are always up in arms and demonstrating. I think also it's an important aspect to educate our communities on the kind of jobs that they can be able to access in terms of this green mineral strategy. And we need to hold the space as civil society in terms of ensuring that our communities are front line and center in creating an opportunity for us to leverage on the green mineral strategy. So back to you, Kuda. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Alaka. And first of all, I'd like to apologize. I should have reminded the listeners that this X-Space is hosted with Global Witness and Partial Africa together. So thanks so much, Alaka, for coming through so strongly with really a diverse understanding of the different roles that civil society can play within driving the Africa Green Mineral Strategy. And I think because of the audience that we have here, that's really important. And I'm hoping the different listeners were able to catch on to think that could really work for them. So moving on to Farai. Farai, I think I want to ask you this question based on linking it with something that was said earlier by Adrian around the geopolitical force at hand. And as we know, our minerals are not our own, essentially. Historically speaking, there's always been a strong emphasis on keeping Africa at a sector level. And when we were preparing for this, I think about a week or so ago, now 2 weeks, we just saw a US negotiated peace deal between Rwanda and DRC, which includes the supply of critical minerals. And in my opinion, they co-opt language such as regional integration, value addition, with a nice caveat at the end, with US investment. So my question to you, Farah, is a more political economy one, which is this a sign of cooperation? Is this a sign of cooperation as we're trying to imagine it globally speaking, or is this the resource extraction that policies like the Africa Green Mineral Strategy should really be putting a stop to? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kuda, and thanks to Adrian and Alaka for setting the context. Yeah, I think there are two nuances to your question. Kuda, the timing. I think I can speak about the language, but the timing, especially the timing of the new year's administration, in defense and military taking a center role, and its interest. And when you circle back to your question to say, is this a win-win situation or it's one-sided? I have to say, I think it's to support US military capabilities, but what more importantly is to make sure that the US is back in the game, having lost access and control of critical mineral supply chains to China. So the DRC is very, very strategic. Why it is 70% of cobalt is coming up in terms of lithium reserves, it is tungsten and so forth. So from that perspective, one could safely conclude that this is not meant for regional cooperation of Africa to benefit. But again, when you look at it from the ultimate core of the green mineral strategy, which is what we are discussing, when you look at that deal, it's not for the African continent in as far as addressing one, our energy crisis or energy paradox, the finance paradox, food security paradox. It's a situation in which the deal is there to pave way for American commercial interest to have a footprint in DRC and in Rwanda, to claim investments and to access mineral products or raw materials, as it were. So I would conclude that I think this is strategic, not to the African continent, but to the US, to ensure that it decouples from China, to ensure that it has control over critical mineral supply chains in Africa. Over to you, Koda.
Thanks for that depressing, Farai. It gives me more stress than I was expecting to get, but I think you speak the truth, and that's what's more important, to really show at least our listeners that the movements that are happening are not only from Africa. There's so many other players involved in this game, and what we do is important as a counteraction. None of these are more colonial or neo-colonial activities, and thanks for that really global, regional outlook, Farai. And I think what I would like to do now is get our last speaker, Judy, on board and really bring us back right onto the ground. I think that's where we all live. We understand mining communities. We are part of them in one way or the other, right? Through the products or the understanding of what mining means to a lot of regions of the continent. So Judy, I think my question to you really is, as mentioned by Alaka and Adrian, the Africa Green Mineral Strategy is not the only policy on the continent around mining. And what I'm trying to drive to here is, what are the main challenges of African mining policies being translated into communities? But I think even more importantly and critically, should they even play a role? You know, should African policies really try to get all the way to the ground, or that's really not their ambit? It'd be great to hear your point on this.
Hi, let me know if my sound is okay. I've heard earlier today that it's a bit patchy, my connection, but just let me know, then I'll move to my phone. Can you hear me okay?
No, it's fine.
Okay, great. Yes, so that is a very interesting question, and I think it is something that is very, I wouldn't say hotly debated. It's kind of like, I think still living kind of in the background, but it's certainly something that's more and more hinted at in conversations about Africa's energy transition. So I think something that's worth mentioning in the context of the African Green Mineral Strategy is that it doesn't say a lot about communities, and I think, yeah, I think sometimes when we use the word communities, I mean, it's a common trope that it homogenizes people, or it when we use that word, we romanticize groups of people, or we've got this idea of it's like this group of culturally distinct people that live somewhere in tune with nature or something. And I think, for me, I just think it's useful not to use the word communities, but rather just people or ordinary Africans. because I think that language shifts to people don't have to also, always act collectively. If you and I can act as individuals for our own interests, then everyone should be able to do that. So kind of that just referring to big groups of people and that they something that's the same or want to interact the same, I think we need to move beyond that. So firstly, the question is, should these types of policies deal with communities or community interests? Well, the question is, if they're not for ordinary Africans, then who are they for? They should be at least for for the electorate, right? For ordinary citizens who may or may not live in rural areas, who may or may not move in and out of rural areas, or who may or may not have strong social ties to rural areas that are affected by mining or industrial projects. So, I think in principle, absolutely, they have to. If we want to use our minerals to progress in some way and to advance like the health and wealth of people, then yes, they should benefit ordinary people. They should be pro-poor. They should have some kind of social justice angle to them. And I think that that is also from a kind of political legitimacy point of view, that is what your voters are expecting. They're expecting, there's definitely a sentiment on the continent from ordinary people that we don't want to give these things away for free anymore. We don't just want these companies and, geopolitical players to come in and take what they want. And I think that has often mobilized in elections against certain candidates who are too friendly to foreign interests. So in terms of just political legitimacy, there's definitely a demand from electors and there's definitely a demand from ordinary people that they want to see some benefit from mineral extraction. But the question is, what benefit? I think when we speak about justice dimensions or how communities benefit, there are so many different ways to view this. I think if we speak about something like justice, of course, we can all, put a few words together in a word cloud and say we agree that this is what justice is. But justice is very multi-dimensional. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. There's different ways to enact justice. And if we think about distributional justice, which is really, what a lot of justice scholars say is the most important aspect of justice, is how do benefits and costs actually get distributed to people? Even there, there's lots of debates over what is the most just way to surface benefits of mining and to distribute that to ordinary people. And then second of all, I think that in the whole energy transition landscape, we also have this global dimension of justice for the earth, climate justice. And if you look at the African Green Mineral Strategy and you look for the word justice, it's mentioned 3 times, and it's mentioned in terms of climate justice. It doesn't say anything about ordinary people. It doesn't say anything about, it doesn't go into a lot of detail about the of communities. It does say that social and environmental impact assessments are important, but it doesn't really in a clear way say, what role communities should play. But I think apart from that, the strategy is still very much aimed to uplift ordinary people wherever they may find themselves. The strategy is very much aimed at, moving African countries along the structural transformation path, which means, over time, better paying jobs, more productivity, more bang for your buck, more local capital. And so it does aim to play that long game, which we do see is in the long term a pro-poor game. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
It definitely answers the question and complicates my understanding of what community is. But thank you for that, Judy. I think that really puts it across that. It's interesting how you focus on the idea of people rather than community. And that really does check my personal thinking around that in a lot of ways. And it problematizes what we understand as stakeholders within this issues. But I think it also provides at least your frame of thinking around what people are, the electorate, or just being African. What does that mean in terms of our ownership of these resources? And of course, the benefits that you mentioned. And I want to circle back, right, to Adrian and put it across to Adrian that we've got this global picture from Farai, and then Judy really showed the complexities of what community is and people, right? But we're also seeing within this policy framework, this proliferation of policies around critical minerals that recently, or not recently per se, but over the last year, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia have also developed their own national critical minerals policies. So my question to you, Adrian, is As you mentioned earlier, there's the European Union, right, which has got quite a coordinated strategy around critical minerals, etc., etc. Are we seeing the same level of coordination between some of these national critical mineral policies and the continental one? What do you think is working in terms of that? What's not working? What are you happy about? What are you worried about? It'd be great to hear your thoughts on that, Adrian.
Thanks, Kuda. So after having reviewed the national mineral strategies to which you are referring, I would just sort of say at the top that there is very limited reference or integration of direct reference or integration of concepts or ideas coming from the African green mineral strategy. But now I want to say two things on that. So the first thing I want to say is that just because the African green mineral strategy is not sort of name checked in the footnotes of the national strategies doesn't mean that the ideas which are in the African green mineral strategy are not having some sort of normative influence on how national policymakers think about their strategies. So, for example, the South African critical mineral strategy is quite, one thing that's quite noteworthy about it is that it places a greater deal of emphasis on cooperation, which is again now something that overlaps with the African green minerals. What I'd say is that to a certain extent, the continental strategy, the development of the continental strategy, and the development of the national strategies have been sort of processes that have gone parallel, but have never really met, if I can put it like that. So I think, yeah, we have to sort of also be charitable to policymakers just because of the timelines around the development of these strategies. So, for example, just to use South Africa as an example, the South African National Critical Minerals and Metal Strategy came out in June, whereas the African Green Mineral Strategy was made public earlier this year. And so I question the extent to which policymakers had sufficient time to actually sensitize themselves to the findings of the African Green Mineral Strategy, and to then sort of draw out the relevant implications of that, and then integrate those findings into the National Mineral Strategy. So, as I say, there is sort of limited reference to the continental strategy in the national strategy, but I think at the same time we are still in the sort of early days of the development of these strategies, and I think one piece of helpful advice that I would give would be to I think we should treat these strategies not as finished products but as starting points, because we need to treat them as living documents, and we need to recognize that they are subject to ongoing change as conditions change and as new policy frameworks are developed that need to be integrated into national frameworks. I think it's best if we don't treat them as finished products, but we rather treat them as sort of works in progress. So yes, that's what
I think you're a lot more charitable than I am, Adrian, and to take the host control of the conversation. But just to further question that point that you made is, it's my assumption, it was our assumption, right, that we've been speaking about the need for regional integration for the last 10 years, 20 years, as far as I'm concerned, right, in the mineral space. And you'd think, our ministries have been involved in the creation of the Africa Green Mineral Strategy while it was still in the process of being set up. I'm just putting that out there to say that I'd like to believe that there was some knowledge beforehand, but I do think the charity is still important, that this was a parallel process, but that also highlights maybe something we should think about more to see what can be done to really ensure that, as you said, the language is there, there are commonalities between these strategies, but what can be done to ensure that the parallelness of these strategies in terms of implementation is a lot more combined, and that way we can get some results. So thanks for that, Adrian.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. I would also just say that we shouldn't think of the relationship between the continental strategies and the national strategies as being sort of one directional, i.e. the continental strategy influences the national strategy. I think it would also be interesting to think about the ways in which national strategies act as sort of embodiments of countries' thinking and priorities around the development of their critical minerals, which then goes on to help continental policymakers think about how they can better inform continental policies based on national priorities. So thanks, I'll just stop there.
Great points, great points. It's a two-way process, and that's fair. Thank you so much for that, Adrian. And dear listeners, as I think I got 2 or 3 more questions for the speakers, but please feel free to start thinking of your questions, so that once I'm done with the next 2 or 3 questions, I will definitely open it up to you. Some some people who have direct access to my phone have already started sending me questions. There's some journalists on this call who already sent me 1 or 2 questions, and I appreciate that. So please do feel free, listeners, to start preparing some questions, and you will have an opportunity soon to speak to that. That said, we carry on. And Alaka, a big passion of mine, at least a passion and a reality really of our mining space, is that it is full of artisanal and small scale miners. And in my reading of the Africa Green Mineral Strategy, they are barely mentioned. Is this an oversight, Alaka, or is an inclination from our policymakers on the continent focusing on more formalized medium and large scale miners? And what does that mean in terms of our development trajectory on the continent?
Thank you, Kuda, for that question. I mean, we cannot take away from artisanal and small scale mining, which is what we're calling ASM, because I mean, if you look at previous years and previous studies, EITI, NRGI, and other organizations, IGF, have put together quite a number of studies around ASM, artisanal and small scale mining, and they produce, and it's said to produce, an estimated 40 million people work in the sector globally. So, and even with 40 million working in the sector globally, it still remains largely unregulated, and limited information in terms of geological, knowledge around ASM, for the miners who are working in the ASM sector, around revenues, employment, operations. So the informality of the sector, I mean, has managed to, spill over to now conversations around critical and green minerals. Whether it's an oversight or not, I think that's up for debate. But I think for me, I would look at it more of an opportunity for a sector that's actually looking to advance, looking to advance in terms of conversations on use of our minerals moving forward. If you're looking at conversations around ASM contributing towards critical minerals, you look at things like lithium, cobalt, tin, tantalum in areas like DRC, Indonesia. Moving forward, ASM is actually quite a big contributor towards those minerals which are actually being used in the energy transition supply chain. So even though it's branded as informally, it lacks regulations. I think the sector itself, it coexisting in that sort of area is an opportunity for us to see how we can be able to pay more attention towards formalization of the sector. Also, we need to look at the opportunities that ASM is going to give in the critical minerals agenda. Should we continue to? I think it's important that as civil society push towards formalization. But as I said, this formalization cannot be looked at as a means to an end, but something that is a continuous activity on what ASM would look like if it was formalized. So the foundation of it all is the geological foundation and exclusivity of certain mineral areas. In a lot of these countries, say for example DRC or Indonesia, you find that tin or cobalt that is being extracted, in some of these areas. It's important that these countries have put together areas where they've ring-fenced, whereby these ASM activities are happening, and therefore in that area you can be able to now sort of formalize this element of ASM, and also look and see whether this, how much it's actually contributing towards the critical minerals agenda. So two takeaways from here is that it can go a long way for governments to actually look at ASM as a test, as a test case on sourcing of critical minerals, how to legitimize ASM, to use it as an idea on how to do that. Another thing is, I think we need to rethink how our policies and our regulation towards ASM is. We're looking at it as more, because nature abhors a vacuum. We are assuming that these ASM miners don't actually know how to figure out, know how to do, this mining themselves, know how to access the tools, know how to actually look at the land and figure out the minerals. So it's actually looking at them and figuring out how we can be able to learn, a few things from them in terms of regulation and policy moving forward. Another thing I think is it's another opportunity for us to reach out to governments from a point of oversight in terms of social and environmental issues that come around in terms of ASM. And that's not only for ASM, it's in terms of the environmental and health and safety issues that will happen in terms of, critical mineral mining, moving forward. So ASM can be the test case on if we can be able to leverage ways in which we can be able to curb environmental health and safety issues. And we can use that for the larger issues around large scale and medium scale mining. So ASM is normally very neglected, but it's also a very good opportunity for governments to look at ways in which they can be able to leverage, even in terms of their revenues and also in terms of job creation moving forward. So just like you, Kuda, I'm very passionate about ASM. It is not a forgotten area, but we should now look at it more as an opportunity for governments, and as Adrian mentioned, for governments to actually tap into their resources in which they can be able to create a more formalized sector moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Zalaka. I think you really hit the nail on the head there, explaining the importance of artisanal small-scale miners within the mining space. Even though maybe within a lot of our policies, they're not mentioned explicitly, there is room to really work. And back to the point I mentioned earlier, as a society, to highlight the importance and not to be seen as a nuisance or a problem, but to really be seen as an opportunity and a solution, especially for locally based development and economic growth. So thanks so much for that, Alaka. And I think I'll go on to Farai. And Farai, with all strategies, my brother, and I'm sure you're very aware of this, we're always very stressed about action afterwards. I'm aware of the Africa mining vision, and I think one of the speakers, my apologies, I can't remember who it was exactly, mentioned how the Africa mining vision has not been fully applied in African countries. I think from my research, only 4 countries have done it, and that ratification process is important, right? That was for the Africa mining vision. At least this Africa Green Minerals strategy is a strategy. It is not a legally binding document per se, but it is a strategy. So in terms of implementation, Farai, since this is a strategy, what does implementation look like of an African-focused strategy? Are we focusing on the country level? Are we focusing on the African Union level? Because my worry is that we don't want this beautiful strategy, beautiful paper, to become a paper tiger or a paper lion or a paper Simba, as it's called in East Africa, or a paper Shumba, as it is called in Southern Africa. Your thoughts on this, Farai? Okay, my apologies. I think Farai, we lost you there. I'm hoping you heard me, Farai.
Kuda, I can see Farai has listener status, so maybe you can upgrade him to a speaker.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. Yes. Farai, I'm hoping you've been upgraded. The millennial me is very disappointed with myself.
So yeah, it's quite depressing learning from the implementation or the domestication of the Africa mining vision. But I think we need to be reflective and admit that there's so much that this strategy can do. I think the first thing that it does, which is more transformative, it sets the tone for the entire continent in terms of what we want to see from the green minerals or the critical minerals that we are endowed with. The onus is upon political leaders, the onus is upon member states of the African Union to give legs and a head to the Africa Green Minerals strategy. Through one, I think already you did touch on, we're seeing bilateral agreements between countries like Zambia, for instance, DRC and EU, Zambia, DRC, and the Americans. So I think the challenge which we have is that there's lack of a common vision, especially around energy transition and green minerals. And I think the coming in of the AMGs, it sets that continental vision. It sets that continental tone of what development should look like for Africa, capitalizing on green minerals. But the political capital and the political support going to come from the African Union, needs to come from the member states. Let's think back in the 1950s and 52, when Europe was very hungry, they created the common agricultural policy and ensure that they put resources to it. And see where they are today. I think Europe is more food sovereign. So I think the strategy can't do so much. The onus is upon member states to move it beyond a tiger paper or a lion paper, actual implementation framework. But this is where I think civil society needs to come in. This is where think tanks needs to come in to come up with models on what a regional value chain would look like for Africa. What are the benefits for countries like DRC? What are the benefits for Zambia in cooperating at a regional level with DRC, Mozambique, Ghana, and so others and so forth? I think that empirical evidence would make a huge case in terms of policy implementation and policy influence. I think we need to go beyond championing it without empirical evidence on what are the gains, what are the opportunities, what are the trade and the benefits, the trade-offs for the African continent. If we can't do that, I think we'll always be pointing blames at the political actors, especially the African leaders. But I think as civil society, as industry, we also have a role to play in energizing the implementation of the Africa Green Mineral Strategy. Over to you, Koda.
Thanks for that, Farai. And I'm so proud of the ownership you're showing here to show that from an implementation point of view, it's really up to a lot of stakeholders. So we can't be then finger pointing, right? As this strategy plays itself out when we are worried that there's lack of implementation, when the implementation is really up to us. So thanks so much for that, Farai, especially on that point around regional value chains and on the potential of that, which is a very big part of the Africa Green Mineral Strategy. And for dear listeners, for those who would be interested to see what the African Green Mineral Strategy actually says. You can find it on the African Union website, readily available, and it really helps at least give some context, more context to what we're discussing. Yeah. And Judy, I think this will be the last question from me as a host. And you, Judy, we work within this just transition space, right? Where we're constantly looking for ways for Africa to move from where we are right now. And I'm speaking about the lack of development, our energy poverty on the continent, the lack of employment, or even where there is employment, underemployment, or bad employment, you know. So we're trying to transition from one space to the other. So I think my question to you, Judy, is the AGM is, I understand it is a just transition document, right? Which is aiming to transform African economies, focusing on energy transition minerals. What are the main challenges that we should be aware of that can derail the strategy from that point of view around really aligning the continent to reduce the energy poverty on the continent?
Yeah, I think there's two areas that could derail us. The one thing is that the document certainly has these types of aims to kind of help African countries use their minerals to play catch up by adding value to minerals, by capturing more of the benefits of minerals, by capturing more of the rents or revenues from minerals, and then kind of plowing that back into industries or into ventures that can create more high-paying jobs, local capital, human capital, those types of things. And I think there's two big challenges. The first one is that there's this very delicate balance for any country, and I think something that we need to realize is, most countries in the global south that are endowed with minerals, most of these countries have been trying to add value to those minerals for decades. It's kind of a accepted recipe in development economics to do this. And so, it's not a new idea. There might just now be kind of globally a bit more support for this idea. I think 10 years ago and 20 years ago, when African countries used the word value addition, it was very much associated with resource nationalism, where I think maybe in some pockets that's still the case. But there's definitely more, I think, support for that. And I think the criticality of these minerals has kind of opened this window of opportunity where African states have a little bit more bargaining power or in a slightly better position to say, we can have autonomy over our minerals and agency over how it's used. That being said, I think the first challenge is that there's this very delicate balance between wooing investors and attracting capital from outside of our borders, because that is largely necessary. There are very few countries that can really fuel and fund this transition locally. That would be the dream. But most African countries are very reliant on foreign investment. So there's this delicate balance between wooing investment, and the only way that you do that is by promising a return, but then also negotiating a larger share of the pie. And I think also making promises or public statements about how this wealth is aimed to be redistributed. Because I think for an investor, those words sound like risk to them. That sounds like anti-private sector sentiment in one way or another, even if it's just kind of a slight thing that they'll keep back of and keep monitoring if there's maybe policy uncertainty of what direction these types of sentiments eventually go. But it's very difficult, I think, to attract that type of investment. And I think a lot of the language publicly is a lot of this kind of like win-win language. But in the day, investors want to return. They want to make a profit. They are going to be interested in realizing a certain business case for their mining operations, for their industrial ventures. And often these mining operations and industrial ventures, they rely on a very precarious business case. I think there's kind of this rhetoric or this belief that mines just print money. And sometimes they do. It really depends on the global demand for a certain commodity. But I know that mines get switched on and off, and many mines spend years mothballed because the commodity price is just not at a level to make it feasible to mine. And so mining is a very volatile industry. There needs to be very clear guarantees that if you put your money in, you're going to realize a return. And so attracting the capital that we need to make this transition is very tricky. I think the second thing is that, just coming back to the first question that you asked me, I think the second thing in derailing the the just transition benefits or just transition kind of bigger picture with this type of strategy is that we only define justice at a global and national level. So I think in terms of national outcomes, African agency, economic development outcomes, I think the African Green Mineral Strategy is very much aligned to pursuing those outcomes. It's very clear for me when you read it, in an ideal world, if the provisions in the document were perfectly implemented, I can see how that leads to a benefit at the national level, and I can see how that can deliver some economic benefits, and that we can hope for some trickle down and some more jobs and more productivity and kind of a lot of the economic indicators that are important to African economies. But I think at times there is a tension between driving this national type of growth and the impact of people who live close to extractive operations, close to industrial operations. And I think we haven't really reconciled what do we do with the costs of industrialization, whether that's pollution or putting people off their land or modernizing African people's lives in a way that there's a loss of cultural identity or loss of nature-based livelihoods or loss of sustainable agriculture, small-scale agriculture. I think we must also think about how do we deal with the type of development that we're inviting with the AGMS. And it's not to say it's right or wrong, it's just about balancing that with other interests. I think there's a lot of debate over, yes or no for modernization or yes or no for development. It doesn't have to be a yes or no. I think this is a uniquely African document. It's open to interpretation. And I think what needs to be done is a uniquely African interpretation of how do we achieve some hybridity between this path to industrialization and new technology and, globalization, but then also kind of maintain a uniquely African identity and preserve culture and preserve land in a way that still preserves unique African aspects of the strategy. And I don't know if we've really debated that or thought about those dimensions in enough granularity.
Fantastic, Judy. I think thank you so much for that. And I was actually, while you're speaking, looking at some of the questions I got from journalists on this issue. And I think your last point really about understanding the impact, right, at a community level and environmental level, I think you've really expounded on that. And we're asking ourselves these very heavy questions. And I think you're right to say that the Green Mineral Strategy, from my reading, is very production focused. We're lacking a sense of clarity around what does this mean? Are we saying that with certain communities, there's the right to say no, that it's okay not to mine in these areas when we know, for example, maybe there's the cobalt right underneath their feet? Are we dealing with some of these questions? And also the bigger one, right? We cannot mine forever, and that brings issues around recycling and broadly speaking, circularity. Are we thinking about that in terms of some of these value chains to stop this constant need to basically dig up the earth that we live on? So I think that's a great, excellent segue really into what I'm hoping are some questions. I do have questions here, dear listeners, from people who are coming through my phone, which is very naughty, but that is okay. But I'd like to provide you the opportunity first, if you can, to just request to ask a question to the listeners, to the speakers, or a point of clarification, or even raise your own inputs on this issue that we're discussing here. So please feel free to just raise your hand. I think it's called requesting on X-Space. As they say at auctions, there's going once, going twice. But here we don't do that. We give ultimate opportunity for people to jump in with ideas. So please do feel free to share. But while we are waiting, I'd just like the speakers to think of two of these questions. Does the strategy provide enough provision around finance? That's something for you there. And then I've got some requests now. I'm just seeing if they've been accepted. My apologies. No, they were not. Maiga, yeah, exactly. Maiga, I think.
Yes, thank you so much, Kuda, to giving me the floor. I think this topic's really interesting, and I really appreciate, how the speaker really talk about it, talk about the project. So my main issue, or the comment that I'm gonna do is I would like to draw attention to a critical gap in the dissemination of the African green mineral strategy, which while gaining, increasing traction in Anglophone country through IMDC and led workshop and conference remain, relatively unknown in Francophone country. And this is really a limited, visibility in concerning, especially considering that a significant share of African critical minerals reserve, such as gold, cobalt, lithium, graphite, bauxite, and rare earth element is found in Francophone countries like DRC, Guinea, Mali, Niger, and Cameroon. And the lack of engagement in this country is slowing down the implementation of the strategy on the continental scale. So, without really awareness and ownership at the national level, particularly led by the Ministry of Mine, Energy, and Environmental in this country, particularly in Francophone country, we are struggling to align their policies. With the continental agenda. So, and I think that this could be uh, hide their effort to build really regional value change and negotiate more equitable terms in the global energy transition. And I think that we need to bridge this gap and propose the organization of a francophone regional conference of the African on the African green mineral strategy that can be led uh, in Senegal. And the main purpose of this conference is to or to bring together government agent and also expert and also all the key stakeholders from across French, Francophone Africa or Anglophone country, to discuss the strategy, explore what is its relevance for national policy and identify the pathway, for implementation. So that's the point that I want to mention here. Thank you so much for that to giving me the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Maïga. Vraiment, c'était un gros problème. And I think we really need to start working on this a lot more in terms of popularizing the green mineral strategy within the Francophone countries. So thanks so much for that point. I'll then ask Nsama, please do feel free. And then after Nsama, LJN, please do feel free to jump in.
Thank you so much, Kuda, for the opportunity to share a few thoughts. But I think before I proceed, I just want to give thanks to the organizers for putting up, first of all, such a lovely panel. I think they've done justice to the topic. The choice of the topic itself and the speakers, I think, is apt. What is emerging really is that there's a lot to dissect on this topic. Almost every speaker that spoke, you get a sense that there's a bit more they would have loved to share if there was a bit more time. But of course, time is usually what we always don't have. But only to draw from that impression that this is part of the conversation we could embrace at national level. But even before we begin to think about embracing these conversations at a national level, is to appreciate that not everybody is sold on the African green mineral strategies. Yes, a number of civil society organizations could know a bit more about this, but at broadly at the national level, sub-national level, this is a topic that people may not really relate with. Not because it is not important, but because maybe we can do a little bit more to help them see the relationship between what they're doing and how it impacts the region, the sub-region, and the whole African region as a whole. I just want to speak a bit more specifically on one aspect, which is the ASM. And I say this with a very heavy heart because in the last week, we've lost lives in this country, lives that we could have prevented, we could have preserved. These are, entrepreneurs. These are what people call illegal miners. And as published what you pay Zambia, In the meeting we held with the Minister of Mines in January, where we invited to discuss illegal mining, we submitted that can we consider stopping using the word illegal? Because if you walk up to an adult and tell them what you're doing is illegal, you are actually already you're already accusing them, and you are likely not to get cooperation from them. They will resist, and friction arises. It seems they didn't take that up until the force was used, and over 10 lives have been lost. Of course, official statistics are pointing to less than that. But why am I saying this? Is because there was one of your speakers who provided us with opportunities that the ASM provide. And in our submission to the minister, we mentioned that we can learn from the so-called illegal miners. There's information they have about mining that those of us who've gone to school with masters and degrees in geology and mining science and so on, we are not willing to pay attention to. And that's something we need to begin to stop. There's always indigenous knowledge. And part of the gap is us, the educated who speak English or French, looking down on those who we think do not. And that's part of the problem. So I appreciate, and I thought I would just speak to that a little bit more, because there's really a lot we can learn from the ASM. But one of the things we need to do is let's be careful, mindful of the terminologies, the nomenclature that we use. I pause here for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, my brother Ntama, for that from across the Zambezi. We really appreciate that. Significant focus on ASMs. LJN?
Yeah, thanks, Kuda. It's Lauren from Natural Justice, and I want to just say what a rich discussion. Thank you for this panel. I think just to add some points within Zama as well about this distinction of these terminologies of illegal miners versus artisanal miners. From my sort of work experience, I've worked with artisanal miners, and I can say that they don't want to be called illegal miners. And I think it is about how we use this terminology and how we embrace the artisanal mining sector, where in South Africa, recently there's been a bill to our mining law where artisanal mining licenses are being introduced to allow for this sort of terminology to stop being used in this culture of calling these people illegal. They're artisanal miners. I think just second point is around what Judy was saying, and I really appreciate what she entered into this sort of discussion. And it's been a point of contention for me as well, is about the fact about how much mining, obviously damages the environment. And this is why there's this necessity for rehabilitation. However, we've seen in the past, obviously, rehabilitation hasn't been very successful with mining companies who finally leave abandoned mines. And then we're having bigger, obviously, environmental and social issues sort of happening from that. So I think what a really good question for the panel from my side is as Natural Justice, we work with communities and Indigenous people. And there this term has become quite popular of de-risking mining activities, which means obviously us being able to sell this to communities, this idea of the African green mineral strategy. So I think for the panel is, how do we sell it to communities? Are things going to change, or do we need more change to happen before we start selling it? And can we be confident enough to sell this to communities and Indigenous people so that they are on board with obviously the strategy?
Thank you for that question, LJ. And before we ask the speakers to respond, Giboyega, please feel free to provide an input or question.
All right, thank you, Kuda and team, for this excellent conversation. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I mean the issue around which mineral resources is critical for me has been plugging African, and the question I was going to ask is, for how long shall we continue to talk about these and not take action? I also imagine that the civil society space have been working in silos over time, perhaps due to lack of general understanding of what it means in economic terms, and then what it also means for development. So for me is, how long shall we continue in this trajectory until we eventually make progress? Thank you.
Thank you for that. So our four main speakers, feel free to respond to either of those questions. You have the mic in your hands effectively, and we'll get to the next round of questions.
Thanks, Kuda. If I can just jump in here, I'll address the first question because the lack of sort of francophone engagement on the issue of critical minerals is, I mean, all I can really do with that comment is to agree with it. I mean, one of the things we do at SCI is that we manage the African Green Mineral Observatory, which is a platform that sort of seeks to map mineral profiles of different countries. And I must say that the majority of countries that we've done thus far have been countries in Southern Africa. What I'd say, but I would say that, again, this is not necessarily a policy oversight. To my mind, it might also have things to do with, well, one, the sort of geography, or rather the geology of these minerals. Because exploration data is quite limited in Africa, policymakers tend to start with those countries who are already large-scale producers of certain key minerals and who they know have large untapped deposits and reserves of these minerals. So I think that is really the reason why there's been this sort of tendency to focus on the Anglophone countries. But I do definitely agree with the question that was raised that, of course, we don't know what we have, of course, until we explore, and we might find that the continent is much wealthier than we already assume it is. So yeah, that's what I just say on that point about the lack of sort of francophone engagement on the critical minerals issue.
Thanks for that.
Sorry. Yeah, I really like Lauren's question about how do we sell this strategy to communities or at the community level. That's a very difficult one. I think that what the strategy promises is, again, at a country level, at a regional level, it holds a lot of promise for the long-term developmental gains, for really changing the structure of an economy, for inviting more investment, for stimulating economic growth more broadly, for inviting more investment in infrastructure and energy and enabling industries that ultimately make countries and regions more productive, and ultimately in the long term offers more jobs and hopefully more dignified jobs, more specialist jobs, more high-paying jobs, more specialist products, more human capital advancement, and just more money circulating to do other things, and more taxes to provide social services. So that's the long game, and I think again, when I read the strategy, I can see if it was perfectly implemented, that is where we could head. The problem is that there's no guarantee that those benefits will necessarily accrue to the same people who bear the costs of extraction. There is just no guarantee. It really depends on, I think, more granular level mining law. It depends on what, at a national level, how mines are regulated. It depends on what type of miner and what their kind of global commitments are, how seriously they will take environmental and human rights impacts. It depends on the mining method. Is it open cast mining, which really has a big impact on land and heritage? Is it underground mining, where, yes, sure, you may be able to continue living on the surface, but there's some repercussions of the groundwater and blasting effects and all of that. I think that really depends on a case-by-case basis. And then what type of mining method is being used, because we know that communities are often promised, oh, you'll see these benefits, there will be jobs for you, right? We're going to bring development. But then mines also invest a lot of money in labor-saving technology. And at the end of the day, one, they've got fewer jobs. Two, they contract out a lot of the jobs, so it's more precarious. And three, the jobs that they do have, because they're so mechanized, is highly technical. And then they just say, well, the local people can't do it because they don't have the skills. And so we do have to be honest about what type of development and who benefits from the development that mining brings. I'm writing a paper about this at the moment, about mines positioning themselves as agents of development and what that allows them to do. Because there's a lot written about CSR where mines say, okay, we're going to do all these awful things to the environment, but we're going to spend and we're going to do all these nice social programs. So the good will outweigh the bad. But when we place mines and when mines kind of position themselves as the harbingers of development, as development agents themselves, then what they're saying is that your success is coterminous with our success. If we do good, everyone does good. The more activity, the more industrial activity, the better for everyone. And maybe that is so on a broad sense, but I think the difficulty with these industries is the people who bear the cost might miss out on the benefits. It's just no guarantee. And I think it really comes down to very careful planning and enabling local people to participate in these opportunities, helping them to upskill, helping them to be ready to take part in mining value chains. It just requires a more concerted effort. So I think, yeah, that makes it a hard sell to communities, but it is a bit of a gamble. It could be a really great story. It could really turn a town around. It could bring a really sustainable economic base. It could, or it could not. And it really depends case by case who you're operating with and in what context and what legal context you're operating with.
Thanks for that, Judy.
Yeah.
Alaka, any comments?
Yeah, just my comment is just in line to the conversations around the implementation of the green mineral strategy. I think there's a very good opportunity for civil society to pick this up and also work hand in hand with other development partners, maybe now private sector and governments, to actually fill out the gaps in terms of implementation. Because as Adrian mentioned at the beginning of his submission, that this is a live document that could be used either way, a two-way, whether it's government seeking for a blueprint on how to create their own mining codes or to upgrade or to, enhance their regulations, moving forward. Also for civil society to use it in terms of advocacy, policy, and influencing. I think it's a live document that can be used by any one stakeholder to towards the work in the sector. It's not, I don't think it's a document that is rigid and static. I think even the AMDC, as they were putting it together, were looking as a document that can actually be used by different functions and different stakeholders to use it. But that notwithstanding, I do appreciate the comment around how Anglophone have picked it up and how Francophone have picked it up. And also I think it's more the nature in which I know somebody mentioned about how we work in silos as civil society. So maybe this is a good opportunity to use this document to expand our reach as Anglo and reach out to our colleagues on the Francophone side to see how we can be able to do a pilot, some sort of like a webinar or more an intel session with more on a Francophone angle, because also they do have their own unique set of needs and issues in terms of the mining sector moving forward. Another thing I'd also like to thank Nsama, the question on the submission on the ASM. As I mentioned, ASM is quite passionate. It's quite passionate for me. I think it's where I started working, and I do realize the complexities of ASM and talking to government. It's the same, and I know the issues that have been happening in Zambia, moving forward. And I think it's something that as a continent, we need to actually have a very candid conversation on our roles and responsibilities on what and how ASM is more of an opportunity for us, moving forward, as I mentioned, and how we can leverage on it, moving forward. So I hope I hope your work in Zambia it can be able to be used in other countries moving forward in terms of ASM, and also we as Global Witness can continue supporting some of those initiatives, moving forward. So thank you. Over to you, Kuda.
Thanks for that, Alaka. And I think I'll just ask you two more questions, DS, because unfortunately it seems like Farah has dropped off. He is trying to join back. Hopefully he can. But so my two questions will be to the three of you who are here. The first one, and so for context, this is from some journalists that were already thinking about this conversation, have directly spoken to me. The question is, does the strategy address provision of finance to allow countries to establish local processing plants? So that's basically the idea around value addition. What's the strategy doing around value addition from a finance point of view? I know we haven't spoken enough about finance, and that's a critical part of this conversation. And then the other question that I think is important from the ones that have been chosen is what purpose do minerals serve in countries that lack the technology and infrastructure to process these minerals? Does the strategy address this? And I think that this speaks to the idea that there are some countries that have those minerals, but absolutely no technology or infrastructure. Does the strategy say anything towards these two and questions? Feel free, either of three of you, to take this on board.
I think I'll go first. I'll speak to the sort of the financing question. I mean, financing is the sort of great overlooked issue when it comes to Africa's critical minerals. And I think, as was mentioned previously, that there are very few countries in Africa who can who can do viable domestic resource mobilization. You might think of South Africa with deep financial market and so on. But for the most part, it will require attracting foreign direct investment into the mining sector, I mean, in lieu of developing domestic resource mobilization. So it is a sort of great overlooked issue in the debate around critical minerals. But what I will say is that I know that the Development Bank of Southern Africa are working together with the World Economic Forum to produce a playbook of solutions on addressing this question around financing for critical minerals. And this flagship report will come out. It should come out in early August, addressing exactly this question about the question of financing for critical minerals. I'll leave the other question to the other speakers. Thank you.
The other issue, okay, thanks,
Yeah,
Alaka.
could you just repeat the final part of that question? I think my network.
Okay, that is fine. Just give me a second to look at it again. The other question was, what purpose do minerals serve in countries that lack the technology and infrastructure to process these minerals? Does the strategy address this?
That's a very good question. As in, I remember when as I was doing my submissions, you can see the green mineral strategy also, talks about issues around the African mining vision, but it also talks about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is seen as a critical tool for creating, integrated markets. The Continental Free Trade Agreement has been around longer than the Green Mineral Strategy, and it's something that we've been trying, or rather, governments have been trying to implement. And I think a lot of the barriers that have come from that is figuring out how to leverage on what each and every country have. Because you see, you can, as I mentioned before, you can have a country like Kenya that has good people power, and you have the DRC that has the minerals. But is there a way we can figure out how to build a processing plant between DRC and Kenya, say for example Tanzania, and what would go into in terms of tariffs, in terms of creating that opportunity to do that? So now that brings us more. Now that comes down more on a national level and time in sort of our REX, a regional economic cooperation. That is something that I think has been an issue on the continent moving forward. And it's not more, I think it's more political, to say the least. It's just understanding how regional value chains, can sort of work, because you've seen I think recently the DRC and Zambia signed the precursor plant. I think it was 2-3 years ago. They signed an agreement to set up a precursor battery plant. But after they signed that agreement, a lot of that has gone quiet, because on paper it looks very good, but the implementation on how to get, say for example, the lithium, if it's coming in from say Ghana, for example, or the lithium is coming in from the DRC, and you're getting copper from Zambia, or you're getting labor from Tanzania, or you're getting any other minerals that you need to create this battery. So I think a lot needs to go into what it would look like to implement this green mineral strategy alongside the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and also again alongside our national mining codes. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done, but also from a country level, we cannot negate the fact that different countries have different needs based on also their natural resources and their reserves in country. So I think I'd say we as civil society also have an opportunity to create such opportunities whereby we educate and inform said governments or said industry on how we can be able to leverage on some of these issues that are coming up moving forward. So that's what I'll say on that.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Alaka is saying on that last question. How does the strategy help countries with very limited technological ability or infrastructure? I think that speaks to the very essence of the strategy. The strategy is mostly focused on that question. You've got natural endowments that is under the surface, but you might not have anything else. You might not have the right ingredients to make the most of those mineral endowments. And for decades, the country was stuck in just trading access to the endowments, but then they get exported. And the question is, like, how do you get those ingredients? And I think if I think about the task of value addition and the task of structural information, it's not dissimilar to a young entrepreneur that has got 1,000 rand in his pocket or $1,000 or whatever, and needs to build a business out of it. It's like you have an idea, you have got something, but there's so much grafting that's necessary to make something out of make something more of what you have. It's really about states being entrepreneurial And that requires a whole ecosystem of striking deals that bring in capital, that bring in that investment, that bring in technology transfer, that brings in human capital development, that brings in the right type of infrastructure, but that you're not giving away all the benefits. It's constant negotiation, actually. It's a constant negotiation of partners and funders and private sector actors, specialist companies, and the different governance entities that would be required to make something out of your minerals. And countries that have done that successfully are the ones that have the hands that they've been dealt with by being entrepreneurial. And I think that's exactly what the strategy is about. But it is just as useful as a book, pocket MBA book to a young entrepreneur. Like, you can read it, but you still have to go out there and network and attract capital and attract interest and make your business case and deliver on your promises and build an economically viable industry. That is what states are tasked with. And the strategy is definitely some inspiration. Yes, it is a blueprint, but the implementation is very, very complex. And I think there are many reasons to complain about African politicians and African resource governance, and we've got not the best track record. And there's definitely 97% of all our criticism against those in power are 100% accurate. But I do think we need to appreciate that at least a few percentage points of the explanation is that these things are hard. It's not just malintent or people who don't care or they're just too lazy. If any of us were given jobs, in trying to, in the next 5 or 10 years, attract massive investment and, really lift thousands of people out of poverty, I'm sure we would also really struggle. It is really, really, really difficult to do. And I think in terms of what civil society needs to do is ask, like, how do we make that job slightly easier? Like, how do we, spend our brains and our resources and our research funding to do very targeted research? How do we close information gaps? How do we bring people into the same room together so that they can swap ideas and coordinate and plan? What can we do to just kind of move this process along that makes it a little bit easier? How do we inform people and capacitate people and make sure that they've got access to the right networks or knowledge? I think that's a big task for us to do. And I can't remember who asked the question to say about civil society being in silos. I do think at least some of the major African organizations, many of us on this call, I think we definitely do collaborate a lot. And I'm actually sometimes really encouraged by how much effort there is to not be in silos, to share knowledge, to speak to each other, to have these types of conversations, to share our ideas, to make sure we know what others are working on, to collaborate. I think there is more and more a sense that we don't want to replicate each other's work. We want to speak, we want to complement each other's work, we want to work together. So there is definitely an effort also to align our efforts and to make sure it's more targeted.
Thank you for that, Judy. And unfortunately, my dear speakers, I won't be able to provide your last thoughts, but I think what you did share there was really important, not only in the last statements, but definitely the whole session. And it's my hope that the listeners who were able to make this space, you've learned something. Please feel free to reach out to any of us, from the speakers, PowerShift Africa, or Global Witness, who have co-hosted this event. If you want to take this conversation further, if you want to share this conversation, you will be able to find it on Twitter, and we'll make a plan to ensure that it's also available on other platforms in the weeks that come ahead. But with all sincerity, thanks so much for this great conversation from you, Alaka, Adrian, and Judy, as well as Farai, who's unfortunately dropped. Thanks so much to the listeners who came in some really good interventions that provided clarity that is needed for this. But hopefully, and most importantly, we take ownership of the Africa Green Mineral Strategy. We continue our cooperation and understand that at the end of the day, this transformation that we want is really based on our ability within our small spaces to hold, as Judy said, the 1,000 Rand, and see how can we move that 1,000 Rand to move the conversation forward, or to get some actions that we really need for the sake of our continent, so that when we are in 2063, when the African Union vision is coming to fruition, we can look back and say, we did some right things. We did some things very well, and hopefully we can be all part of that journey. Once again, thank you so much, and we look forward to the next one around the critical minerals conversations, and hopefully you can join us then again. Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
for your
you, Kuda.
time.
Thank you, Kuda.